Okay, so welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabagor people of the land in which the Callaghan campus resides, which is where we in the room are located today. Our presenter today, Dr. Michael Robinson, is the National Army Museum Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and is in Australia as the 2024 Shark University of Sydney Visiting Research Fellow. He is author of the monograph Shell-Shocked British Army Veterans in Ireland, Disability History series, and has also published on Great War veterans in War and History, Social History of Medicine, and the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. His paper today, which is co-hosted by the Centre for the Study of Violence and by the Future of Madness Network, reflects his interest in the experiences of Australian veterans and British migrant ex-servicemen in Australia during the 1930s. It is titled War, Trauma and the Great Depression, the Treatment and Experiences of First World War Veterans, 1929 to 1939. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and thanks everyone for having me. It's a real honour to be here to talk. I'd like to start with a disclaimer, if I may, and that is that I'm really talking about this subject today for one of the first times. So it's some way off public. Now I've got a project, but I'm not sure how yet to sort of funnel it into a cohesive sort of narrative. So I just decided to put everything down on a pad. I do know that my research that next Effie. I'll still using my own. I do know that I want to focus on this idea of invisible disabilities with regards to war in the First World War. And these are defined as life-limiting conditions and illnesses not readily discernible to others. And then Anne Davies, the disability studies philosopher, she wrote a great article on the subject of invisibilities. And it was this idea of its relationship to the welfare state. She writes that theoretical and moral quandaries, difficulty of the burden of proof of, saying I'm disabled when it's less sort of objectively verifiable. And this idea really came to us, even though my PhD was on shell-shock, but during COVID. I don't know if these were a thing in Britain, but the lanyards that we see on the right hand were a big thing in Britain. This hidden disabilities really came to the forethought during those 2 years or so of lockdown with the face masks and things like that. So that's when I started thinking about the project. My initial idea, my PhD was on shell shock, men who were in receipt of disability pensions for shell shock who returned to Ireland. And as I was moving through that project, there was this idea of looking at men who weren't in receipt of disabilities pensions, weren't recognised by the state as being disabled by the war. And it was these that I was really interested in looking at further. So when I'm talking in the project that I got funding for, it wasn't just mental illness, but mental illness is obviously going to be a big part of the research. Tuberculosis, breathing difficulties, cancers, even hearing problems from artillery service. That was what my initial application involved. These all sort of long distance disabilities that could arise in the longer term and as veterans aged. But as I'm moving, so I'm about 6 months into my project now, potentially that may be too big. So I want to talk mostly today about mental illness and a little bit about tuberculosis. So with regards to one thing, the impression I get when I talk about my research is I'm interested in looking at mental illness, post First World War, British soldiers, looking at also incorporating space for another one. Next, please, Ashley. And the key reason for this is for three reasons, really. First is, even though there has been a lot of studies on shell shock, especially in popular history, and I'm trying to get more into popular history, my work with the National Army Museum, it's still very much focused on the officer class in popular histories. Sigrid Sassoon, this book was published last year, Soldiers Don't Go Mad. sold quite well, I believe. It very much sold the Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Craig Lockhart story. So I was interested in, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in a little bit about men like my great-grandfather, you know, the more private working class soldier. Another reason I think the space is this issue of time limits. We know very little in Britain of shell shock during the 1930s. The vast majority of shell shock studies are shell shock during the First World War or in the initial post-war years. So I was really interested in, well, what about during the Great Depression? What about, 10, 15, 20 years after the supposed causal event? And as I mentioned at the start, another key reason is studies of shell shock mainly look at men who are in receipt of a disability pension for shell shock and mental illness, and I was interested in trauma and mental illness for men who were outside of the remit of the state and whether it was possible to look at these men. And with regards to tuberculosis, for example, in terms of Britain, there's been no studies at all on disabled veterans who suffer from tuberculosis, even though it was a really important post-war disability. So it's also a little bit of a family history as well. Next, please. Thank you. So the man on the left is my great-grandfather who fought on the Western Front with the Royal Engineers, who scarily looks so much like my dad. It's really unbelievable how much he looks like my dad. I should have really put a photo of my dad next to it because it's really uncanny. And basically, the story we were told growing up, and he died in the mid 60s, I believe, was that he'd go on periodic bouts of drinking, and he would really go on these large benders, on the drink, on alcohol. And the story we were told was that he came back from the war changed. And these stories, whenever I used to talk about my old PhD on soldiers who suffered from shell shock, especially in public histories, the amount of times I would get to hear similar stories. And of course, to what extent was it the war that caused it? Was it, pension of alcoholism? It's very, very difficult to sort of, calculate. But it's these stories I was interested in getting at, these sort of anecdotes that I was hearing time and time again, similar to my own, of a man who throughout the 1930s would suffer from drink, supposedly war-related. It was really these stories I was interested in sort of getting at, because my great-grandfather, even though apparently the story we were told he was changed by the war, wasn't in receipt of a disability pension, he very much got on, and resumed civilian life. So it was really these stories I was interested in trying to get to. So the top right was a pub that he owned, which is now a convenience store. This is a recurring theme, actually, of a lot of local facilities have now sort of gone into private hands. And he was from an area in Newcastle, which is a coal mining village, so it's about 15 minutes away from Birmingham University, which is a really good university in Britain, but it's area of South Hetton, just down the road from me, is also one of the most deprived. So it's this idea of an applied history idea of men, mental illness, class. I think there's also something in that with regards to 2024. So a little bit about myself. So as I said, I wrote my PhD on shell-shocked soldiers who returned to Ireland. And then I did a few separate topics really related to disabled veterans. So I got Wellcome Trust funding for a year to research disabled veterans who migrated to Australia. I then got funding from the Lever-Hume Trust to look at a very top-down policy social science study of different welfare systems. That didn't really work out because of COVID. I was hoping to really look at Canada, Britain and Australia from 1914 all the way until the mid-1980s and how they looked after these men, sort of top-down social science study. The archives and everything shut. I wasn't able to get anywhere for 2 years. So because of that, I really returned to my comfort zone of the interwar period really for the Lever-Hume Trust, which ended recently, and I've recently began at the National Army Museum. So what I'm talking about today is what I've got in mind for a second book, but the earliest I think it's going to be out is probably 2028. And I think it's an amalgamation of all the three studies, projects that I've looked at so far. Next, please, Effie. So what, oh, sorry, the next one. So what I'm interested about Britain is regards to financial expenditure. And one thing I think gets overlooked with Britain. So I am going to talk about Australia as a comparison, but my focus is mainly on Britain. Rather than a 50-50 comparison, it's mainly going to be more of a 70-30, 80-20. I'd like to bring Australia in as a comparison. But what's interesting about Britain is how it's able to reduce costs quite dramatically in terms of state outlay for disability pensions and for medical care. And one reason it's able to do this, and I believe in my own research, it's the only country who fought in the First World War who's able to have such a policy, is it has a 7-year time limit on claims. So from 1921, the British government at the time introduced a 7-year time limit. So from the 1st of September 1928, that's the cut-off point. And after that, there's a barrier. And unlike Australia, for example, that is, that is the date where if you haven't applied and received a disability pension by the 1st of September 1928, then that is the date, when you're pretty much ineligible. So, next please, Effie. That's what I'm really interested in looking at a little bit more. So, incorporating my research today, top-down research, looking at politicians, looking at charities, looking at civil servants. Why was Britain the only country able to successfully implement a time limit policy, which is going to be a big part of my research. But then also from the social sort of history impact. But what does that time limit do on these men in the 1930s? These men who aren't able to turn to the state for disabilities. What about their experiences? So it's sort of these two-pronged approach of looking at the politicians, looking at the policymakers, looking at the charities, looking at government records and things like that, but also looking at social history records, lunatic asylum records, charity records, homeless records and things of that nature. I think as well, because the area of disabled veterans is, it's really come on leaps and bounds over the last 20, 30 years. It's not only just to see this as a study of Britain and where Australia is going to come in, and I'll talk a little bit more as I go throughout today's paper, is what's happening in Britain is impacted by what's happening in Australia and vice versa. Both policymakers and veterans in Australia and Britain look at each other and observe one another. And they say, what is going on in Britain, what's going on in Australia, and that dictates their own movements, which I'll talk about in today's talk. So even though it is predominantly a study of Britain, it's also this idea of it being a study of Britain also as a study of other countries as well. So next slide, please, Effie. So yeah, as I mentioned, most studies on war, medicine, trauma, disability, focus on the war years, the initial post-war years in Britain. Marina Larson described the 1930s as a postscript in the historiography, and I think this is still certainly true of Britain. Crotty, Diamond and Adele in Veterans Benefits, where they looked at veterans' welfare during the 20th century. It's a really fabulous book. I really recommend it to anyone interested in sort of the sociology of politics veterans. And they really would skip over Britain from 1921 until the birth of the NHS, 1921 to 1948. And they say that it was one of policy inertia. And I think they maybe dedicate a few lines to the 1920s and the 1930s. So the story I'm trying to tell is the absence of policy has a story, and the absence of policy also has a huge impact. And as I mentioned at the start, this issue of time limits, this issue of a time limit on claims in Britain, I think it's absolutely critical to understand the British experience of post-war disability and the British veterans' experience of disability. So it's really this issue of the time limit that I'm really trying to dig into. So I'll talk a little bit about the top-down sort of aspect of my research, which is, next slide please, Effie, which is the Ministry of Pensions itself. So this was the British equivalent of the Repatriation Commission. This was the government-funded department which provided disability pensions and state-funded disability rehabilitative care. So it was located in Acton in London on the left-hand side here, but it had headquarters throughout the UK. 11 headquarters throughout the UK. And on the right now, it's been closed down now, and it's very much luxury apartments. No. So there's definitely a recurring theme you go through. Next slide, please.
Everything's luxury.
So I mean, it did pay for medical treatment. It did pay for disability but its main remit, its main outlay was on disability pensions, which was to pay men who were wounded in the First World War and will continue to be disabled by it. So we can see it paid on very similar to the Repatriation Commission. of Australia and paying by a scale, so depending on the severity of your disability. So these were the payments for privates: 42 shillings with 100%, loss of 2 or more limbs, paraplegia, drastic facial injuries down to 20%. This was a weekly pension, loss of a finger on one hand. But as you can see on the right hand side, once you break down the figures, it's very much the minor sort of disabilities. So men were expected to go back to work, and it wasn't sort of a payment to replace work. It was very much in line with, we'll compensate you for your disability, but you're still very much expected to, re-enter the labour market. What's interesting with regards to mental illness, when I looked at the records of the Ministry of Pensions, with the exception of lunacy, which was a man's mental illness requiring an admission into a lunatic asylum, the rules on mental illness are really subjective. It really appears to me grading of, so men would go into a medical board in front of 3 men every 6-ish months, 6 months to a year. And when you look at from 2024, when you read the records, how one man got a 20% disability pension for neurasthenia shell shock and how another man got 90%. It's very, very difficult to sort of work out what were the basing the decisions on. It can really seem sort of ad hoc, and the subjectivity of the examiner really sort of comes out in my research. So with regards to medicine, next slide please, Effie. So in addition to disability pensions, the Ministry of Pensions also paid for medical care, often transferred from former war hospitals, and it ranged from plastic surgery, removal of shrapnel, massages, dentistry, limb fitting, artificial limbs, up and even neurasthenia shell shock. Initially, the Ministry of Pensions provided abreaction therapy in the initial post-war years, and I argue in my War and History article that this treatment that they received, talking therapy, abreaction therapy, would have been unavailable to working class privates outside of these Ministry of Pensions facilities. But a huge problem with this treatment is it was incredibly, in terms of bed space, incredibly small. It was, less than one, even at its height, was available to less than 1% of shell shock veterans. And as I'll talk about today, these facilities were gradually shut down throughout the 1920s and 1930s. But not insignificant amount of numbers. Medical care cost £16 million per annum by 1921, 332,000 beds available for a wide variety of disabilities by 1921. 1921, the Ministry of Pensions outlay is worth 70% of national government expenditure, which for Britain in 1921, is, I would argue, is relatively significant. And I think, as I'll talk about today, civil servants and politicians are aware of the immense cost. And with regards to the 7-year time limit claim, it's a real focus on reducing state liability and reducing costs, which really is a driving impetus of the Ministry of Pensions throughout the interwar period. Next slide, please, Effie. So one thing that comes across time and time again in my research of the 7-year time limit claim is how obsessed, both during the war and in the immediate post-war years, how obsessed British policymakers are, civil servants and politicians are with the American Civil War pension system. And they're looking at elderly veterans by the second decade of the 20th century. And they're noticing that pretty much, I think it's 95% of surviving veterans are in receipt of a disability pension. And their argument is that the American Civil War pension system has pretty much become a de facto old age pension. And more than any other country, I haven't seen it in the Australian records, they look to the American Civil War pension system as a case study to avoid, and they're aware of it very, very early. It comes up as early as 1914. And this is just one quote of many that I've come across. And I think this is a real key explainer of why British policymakers, constantly look what are other countries doing, and are very, very aware of sort of projecting into the future. Next slide, please, Effie. So this 7-year time limit, it's introduced, it appears to me, as really, it's a fear of becoming financially liable for men as they reach their old age. And again, just another quote. These are from the archives of the Ministry of Pension, all these internal records, between department officials. And it comes up time and time again that, you know, in 1921, 7% of expenditure, we've got 332,000 beds for disabled veterans, but moving into the future, we're really going to have to reduce this cost. So 7 years is introduced in the 1921 War Pensions Act. So saying from 7 years from now, that's going to be the cut-off point. And again, what's really interesting, looking in the Ministry of Pensions archive, it appears to me that 7 years is a real political decision rather than a medical one. There's very little input from, you know, the Royal College of psychiatrists, Royal College of Surgeons. It's basically civil servants and politicians who come up with the 7 year time limit, not medical staff. And it really appears to me to be, am I right? And I'm going to try and argue it better than this, but what's the minimum time we can get away with? It appears that 7 years is the time where there's even suggestions of, can we repeat the Workmen's Compensation Act, which is if you're injured in a mine, the time limit is 6 months to claim. Can we incorporate a 6 month time limit? And then pretty much say, no, on your Nelly, can you imagine the uproar, you know, the potential political outcry to that? So 7 years to me, in my research today, it really appears to be a political decision rather than a medical one. And just to say as well, in terms of reducing numbers of veterans, also there's a year-on-year reduction in medical facilities. Each year there's at least one major hospital or clinic or outpatient clinic shut down from 1921 to 1939. So medical facilities and pensions are going hand in hand, a retrenchment and a slow erosion of sort of state-funded facilities. And what the British states argue is, if any disabled veterans, even those in receipt of a disability pension, require medical care, they can go into public health facilities and we'll cover the cost, but we don't want to pay for our own facilities because it's too expensive, basically. So that's a very, very brief overview. Next slide, please, Effie, to where I get up to. So I'm really interested in my research starting the next part of my research. So once I've sort of explained the 7 year time limit, focusing then on this focus on 1928 to 1939. So it was dominated, not exclusively, but dominated by the Conservative Party. Obviously the Wall Street crash, widespread austerity, cost cutting to public health. I think regional variations are something that really need to be stressed, however. Areas like my great-grandfather, these areas like Glasgow, Manchester, areas of London, really impacted by the Great Depression and heavy industry. These were the areas that were really badly impacted by the Great Depression, and it's those areas I'm really particularly interested in trying to get to the bottom of. These men who would have been more likely to enter, you know, post-war employment in heavy industry, but were then badly impacted by the Great Depression. And obviously today we know a lot more about mental health. We know a lot more about social determinants of health. So it's this idea. Looking at retrospectively what we know now to the past. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A about the difficulties involved with this, but that's what I'm interested in doing. I think as well, just with regards to, because obviously, I will just say this with regards to, even though the 1928 to 1939 was dominated by the Conservative Party, just a little as a proviso that there's a minority Labour government comes into power in 1929, and a key manifesto pledge of theirs is to remove the 7 year time limit on claims. And again, reading the archives of the Ministry of Pensions, when the Labour Minister of Pensions comes in, he pretty much gets told by the civil servants, if you remove this time limit on claims, it's going to cost a hell of a lot of money. And the Labour Party actually renege on, I would argue, a key manifesto promise, because it's a pretty thin manifesto. So even though it is dominated by the Conservative Party, it's also the Labour Party on the left of the political spectrum who sort of, you know, rebuff attempts to remove the 7 year time limit on claims. And what's also interesting about my research, so I'm doing a lot more reading on Britain in the 1930s, is how few veterans come up in sort of social histories of Britain of the 1930s. So the 1930s don't really come up in studies of British veterans, but also in studies of 1930s Britain, veterans don't come up in that either. Veterans are sort of become amalgamated into the wider general public and aren't treated as sort of a distinct population. So that's again something I'm going to try and attempt to do with this project. Next slide, please, Effie. So I can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, but just to say that the work continued attempts to try and remove the 7 year time limit on claims by the British Legion which I can talk more about in the Q&A. And it went down the constitutional route of trying to remove it. It held numerous deputations throughout the 1930s with Minister of Pensions, with Prime Ministers, saying this time limit's unfair to all these men who are disabled, but it's sort of only manifested in the longer term. They produced a command paper called the Prematurely Aged Ex-Serviceman report in 1938. And basically each time the government just quite easily defeat. The British Legion in their sort of, in their creation are apolitical in terms of they're not able to play one party against the other. They're not allowed to favour one political party against the other. And this is a strength and a weakness. It's a strength in terms of, you know, having a unified commemorative day on the 11th of November, but it's a real weakness in terms of dictating government policy, because it's very, very easy for the government to go, thanks for raising the concerns. We'll think about it. And then each time it's just knocked back into the long grass. So I can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A if you want. So the next big area of the research, which is, next slide please, Effie, is the non-pension of the 1930s. And I think there is an assumption that maybe these men are difficult to trace. So the top two, so George Orwell in Studies Popular Histories of Veterans. This is an anecdote that's repeated time and time again. George Orwell, and I believe it's in the early 1930s, where he's sleeping in a homeless shelter, and he says a shell-shocked soldier kept him up all night by screaming and roaring his head off. And this is sort of repeated time and time again in popular histories of, we can only imagine how many, you know, such instances occurred, which, you know, are lost to the records. Similarly, on the right is from Roald Dahl's illustrated autobiography of his childhood, and he talks about a teacher who had shell shock, who was very jerky in his movements, and that's another anecdote which is repeated time and time again. And I would argue, actually, beyond, you know, these stories, and stories like my great-grandfather, stories I've heard time and time again when I used to talk to public audiences, veterans come up time and time again in the records themselves, which I'll talk a little bit more today and give you a sense of where I'm thinking of going with my research. So the wider welfare state, lunatic asylum records, veterans, it's amazing how often, once you actually get into the records, they come up over and over again. The records of charities, both veterans and non-veteran charities. This idea of veterans, the 7-year time limit, it comes up time and time again in the archives. Social survey studies by think tanks of the day. Veterans are coming up again and again. Public health reports from Public Health England, Public Health Scotland. Veterans are discussed. And probably the most obvious one, newspaper reports. You know, if you type in ex-serviceman, veteran, ex-soldier, you know, with a time barrier of 1928 to 1939, they come up time and time again. You know, from winning league competitions to suicides, you know, the stories are there in the records. To give an example, Journey's End, which is a play and a movie produced in 1928 to 1930, just coinciding with the release of the theatre play and the movie, is reams and reams of letters from veterans saying, I went to watch this with my ex-comrades and this is how much it affected me, moved us to tears. So it's sort of a history of emotions as well, I guess, as well as disability. So I'm arguing that, so Peter Barham argues in his book, Forgotten Lunatics of the Great War, which I think is really fascinating work. The silent working class soldier actually very noisy encounters, and I think this is very much true of the 1930s, and that his book is almost 20-year-old now. So it's sort of new and old history at the same time, I guess. Next slide, please, Effie. So the wider welfare state, again, I've not gone into too much detail as of yet, but I was recently over the summer in the Lancaster Moor Lunatic Asylum, which changed its name to Mental Hospital during the period I'm looking at. These are in the Lancashire archives in Preston. And just speaking anecdotally here, the amount of times ex-servicemen are mentioned in the records. What's really interesting with regards to if these men entered before the 1st of September 1928, they're very often recognised as service patients. So they could wear their own uniform, they were treated as private patients, the Ministry of Pensions paid for the treatment. But after the day, as you move into the 1930s, and if these men are service patients, their lunacy is recognised as caused by the war. They're immediately recognisable because their writing is in red in a case book. what's amazing is when you go in the 1930s, you have men, because of the time limit, are coming in as, you know, civilian patients and aren't having the same. So it's this idea of a sort of a manufactured boundary of mental illness. So you can literally be admitted on the 2nd of September 1928, but because of the time limit, it appears, you know. So I'm really interested in digging in deeper into these records, these post-1928 records. And I think that, as Effie, you know, looked at in our own records, and with regards to South African veterans, I think that the possibilities of this research alone is really, really, you know, qualitative research, quantitative research, you know, what employment did they have, other sources of welfare, housing, qualitative analysis of the condition of admission, very often accompanied by a member of staff who would provide detailed descriptions of why they need to be institutionalised. So in addition to Forgotten Lunatics of the Great War by Peter Barham, who very much looks at veterans in the asylum, I think the wider when I'm talking about the wider welfare state here, I'm more interested in why were they admitted into the asylum in the first place. And qualitative analysis of the sort of descriptions, I think, is, you know, a real distinct possibility. I should also add that these records I've looked at, they are close to the general public, but some asylums won't let you look at them and some will, as a real sort of ad hoc, but locally Lancashire Archive let me look at them with promises of anonymity and things like that. So what I'm going to provide now is just a small snapshot of some of the testimonies I've found. Next slide, please, Effie. And this is just from one casebook, 1938 to 1939. And these sort of stories come up time and time again of men who were being admitted into lunatic asylums throughout the 1920s and 1930s. So these are all testimonies gained from, it's all the words of the medical superintendent, very often written following the admission records, including very often a wife or a brother or a mother accompanying them in the asylum. And the asylum now is luxury flats again, so which I'm told are really, really nice luxury flats just outside of Manchester. But what's also really interesting with regards to, for example, quote number 5 is not only this idea of disability. This is when I'm thinking that maybe the project's already too big, but the amount of men who go into lunatic asylums with physical disabilities. In the 1920s and 1930s, you have men going in wheelchairs, men going in with artificial limbs, artificial legs, which we know nothing about in the historiography. So they are one of this case study, and again, I was just quickly scoping these records. But what's really interesting about the bottom one was there was a man who entered, and he was an amputated leg from the knee down, and he says that I'm not getting sufficient treatment for my stump. I've went complained to the Ministry of Pensions, they aren't helping me enough, X, Y, and Z. And then later in the record, it actually says that he fell down the stairs because his stump was sort of ill-fitting or not correctly attached, and he fell down the stairs and injured himself. So he has the delusion of not getting sufficient treatment for his stump, and in the records weeks later actually suggest he might actually have a point. So it's just a very, very small glimpse of, I would argue, pretty amazing records actually in terms of what I'm hoping to look at and really dig in deep into. You know, history of gender, masculinity, the role of the families, they're all there. And that's actually, once you start the project, you actually think, is the project too big? I might have to make it much smaller, but it's better that way, I guess, than the other way. Next slide, please, Effie. The role of charities. So in addition to the wider welfare state, the role of charities come up time and time again. So a really influential study of my own, and still much cited for a reason, Deborah Cohen's work, The War Come Home. She very much looks at disabled veterans in receipt of a disability pension. And in her study of Britain, very much argues that the charities were very much an integral part of the rehabilitation of veterans in post-war Britain. And I completely agree with that book. Again, it's another book I always recommend to my students as a great starting point. I would argue post-1928, charities become even more important. It's not only the state and charities working in tandem, but really charities really take on a huge Huge amounts of heavy lifting in terms of veterans. And what's really interesting, once you get into the archives of the British Red Cross, the British Legion, is how often the 7-year time limit is mentioned. And men saying, I would have applied for, because of the time limit pension, somewhat unaware that there was even a time limit in the records, which speaks to this idea of, well, how actually well advertised was this time limit, which I'm unable to answer as of yet, but something worth exploring. And it comes up time and time again. And in response to the 7-year time limit on claims, both the British Red Cross and the British Legion set up specific sub-charities dedicated exclusively to men who were ineligible because of the 7-year time limit on claims, which I think again just speaks to how important it is if the Red Cross and British Legion is setting up their own charities to deal with these men. And it really speaks to this idea that there's a huge section of veterans who are potentially being overlooked. What's also interesting with regards to charity as well, to go back to my old slide, is how often charities are becoming the conduit between a man and the lunatic asylum. They're very often not only coming in with family members, but very often coming in with charity workers, whether it's the Red Cross, Mental Care Association, the Salvation Army. So the role of charity is also in not only distributing funds, but also directing veterans to the wider welfare state. I think is really coming across in the records. British Legion records have reams and reams of correspondence from veterans throughout the 1920s and 1930s, which isn't so much mental illness in terms of delusions and psychosis, but very much disgruntlement, feel like we've been mistreated. So it's a history of emotions as well, I guess, as well as history of disability. There's this idea of it festering into this narrative of this 7-year time limit, playing into this idea that these men felt that they were overlooked and they were being shortchanged and being unduly treated because of this time limit on claims. The charity that's really, really important for my research, so British Legion, British Red Cross, and these sub-charities, next slide please, Effie, is Combat Stress, which was known at the time as Ex-Service Welfare Society, but it's still running today as an exclusive veterans charity, but particularly veterans suffering from mental health problems. Post-traumatic stress disorder today is its main remit. And I've been fortunate enough again to the archivist, even though the records are closed to the public, have been fortunate enough to allow me to have access to the records again with anonymity and things like that. So the records of the 1930s, again, looking at the 1920s, combat stress very much helps men apply for pensions, helps men with disability pensions. But as you go into the 1930s, it continues to help these men. But these men who are coming in the 1930s for the first time with mental health problems are coming up time and time again in correspondence to the charity, in the work of the charity.
Michael, were they called combat stress in the 1930s?
No, it was called the Ex-Service Welfare Society.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when it was renamed, actually. That's a good, but I think it was, obviously relatively recently. So what combat stress did was it had two veterans it had two inpatient facilities, both down south, of around 80 to 100 beds, very much R&R for men suffering from neurasthenia or shell shock. It offered legal representation for veterans, paid for legal representation for men accused of a litany of legal representations, whether it was money problems or assault, things like that. Offered pensions and employment advice. But very often went into lunatic asylums to visit veterans, providing cigarettes, reading material, things of that nature. But again, looking at the records and speaking again anecdotally, it appears to me 1930s, the vast majority of its work is relief work. It appears that the vast majority is discretional monetary donations to help veterans who had a pension or didn't have a pension, who had a very small pension, go back to my graph earlier in the presentation, who were not in a receipt of a pension. And basically, the vast majority of the works appears to be relief from a very subsistence relief, basically, offering money to, have a hostel, a bed and breakfast, to fix the houses, leaking roofs, clothing for job interviews comes up time and time again. Can you give me this money because I want to wear a suit because I want to go to a job interview? Travel, to attend interviews, going to see a general practitioner. So the money that's basically combat stress is being worked during the 1930s appears to me, the vast majority of it is very, very small amounts of discretional funding to a lot of men. So the picture on the bottom right, it's not actually dated, but this is its headquarters in Victoria Street, and it has men, and the description of the photo in the archive is of men going to visit combat stress archives, and they would have a sit-down interview. So they would often start with correspondence, and then they would go in, then they'd be invited to visit HQ, and then they would sort of plead the case in person, say, this is what I need the money for, X, Y, and Z. What comes up really interesting is when you do your research, you're never expecting what to find is dentistry. A huge amount of work done on combat stress is paying for dentistry, and men write to say, I've got, I have teeth problems, I can't afford to go to the dentist. Can you pay for this? And it was just amazing. It was just something I wasn't expecting to find when I got into the archives, but it comes up time and time again, the importance of dentistry. So next slide, please, Effie. So in addition to charities, which I'm hoping to dig in more to, social survey studies. So these are really the think tanks of the day. And there's three real sort of social studies, public health studies, new survey of London life and labour, men without work, and poverty and progress. And basically it's investigators, researchers, academics going into charity workers, going into different areas of Britain and really reporting on areas really badly impacted by the Great Depression. And in the books themselves, war pensioners and ex-soldiers are referenced throughout, without going into too much detail. And what's interesting is social determinants of mental health and tuberculosis discussed. So even if they're not directly referencing veterans and ex-soldiers specifically, they'll say employment's causing depression, unemployment's causing depression, unemployment's causing anxiety, poor housing is causing breathing difficulties, a poor diet is causing, health problems. And I haven't actually looked into the archives yet, but judging by their sort of online descriptions, it appears that when a war pensioner and ex-soldier is referenced in these three works, it appears that once I get into the archives, they'll have more specific information in their archive. But I'm not able yet to comment on that as of yet, but it's something I'm really hoping to explore over the summer when I get back to the UK. Next slide, please, Effie. So this is where Australia comes into it. Because like I said, it's going to be a focus on Britain, but I'd like to incorporate Australia as a comparison of a country that didn't have a time limit, but also because Britain watches Australia and looks at what Australia is doing, and because Australia looks at Britain, both veterans and politicians, I think it's interesting that, because the historiography of disabled veterans is, I would say it's quite a really burgeoning historiography now. I think isolated nation case studies I think it's possible even when you're focusing on a nation to also look at, its international dimensions. So to give an example of Australia, which has a really healthy historiography, I quote, that's another reason why it's a really good comparison is so many great historians have already looked at Australia, Stephen Garton, Marina Larson. So I have a ready-made case study to compare Britain with. So it doesn't have a time limit on. It introduces new, fresh facilities for what it named the burnt-out diggers. And basically, I think I'm right in saying by the mid-1930s, any claim of tuberculosis, if you served on in an active unit, you were, regardless of its causation or apparent causation by the war, you were in receipt of a disability pension. You could receive medical care in an Australian veterans facility. But what's interesting is looking at the British records, is they're watching Australia do all this. They're looking at rising costs in Australia. They're looking at, these mid-1930s legislation in Australia. And what's interesting as you get into the mid-1930s, Australia actually replaces the American Civil War pension system as in a poster boy of what to avoid. And they've stopped talking about the American Civil War pension system. and moved over to Australia. And they look at Australia going, even when, you know, the Labour Party come in and the national government come in, a Conservative national government, it's civil servants, these men in grey suits, who are incredibly important in the history of disabled veterans. A big argument they make is, if you remove the time limit, we'll end up with Australia, and look at Australian costs. They're going up year upon year upon year. What's also interesting is British veterans, the British Legion, some of their archives say, how come we're getting treated so much worse than Australia? So they're using Australia as a comparison of, you know, and looking at the Australian records, what's interesting is Australian state makers appear to be going to their complaints from Australian veterans is, if you think we're treating you badly, look at how the British are treating theirs. So it's sort of a, both countries are using each other as an example for their own purposes. And that's something I'm hoping to dig in further and sort of, yeah, write a little bit more about what's going on there as I move through. So final slide, please, Effie. So just to say as well, no, it's only disability pensions, which I'm interested in with regards to Australia, but it's also this right to state-funded healthcare, very often in exclusive facilities. So unlike Britain, where men would enter public facilities alongside you know, non-veterans, repatriation commission in urban centres particularly, men would be treated in exclusive repatriation commission facilities, which, unlike Britain, which shut them down during the 1920s and 1930s, were renovating and building them throughout the interwar period. You know, this state-of-the-art outpatient clinic in Melbourne was opened in 1937. You know, the absolute opposite of what's happening in Britain, which has, I think, 4 hospitals which can cater to, you know, a couple of hundred men by 1937. So it's not only the disability pension, it's also the medical systems, that, you know, are real inverse of one another in Australia and Britain. So that's something I'm also interested in potentially getting to grips with, although it might be a bit of a journal article. I'm not sure yet. So just to finish, next slide, please. So yeah, so that's a very, very broad outline of what I'm going to be doing for the next 3 years. So I'm incorporating political, economic, social, cultural histories of the First World War. Again, something I'm interested in, this idea of applied history, definitional boundaries surrounding disability today, you know, the links to social deprivation, unemployment, class, mental health. And just with regards to British veterans today, I know more about the British state than I do Australia, but charities today in Britain are absolutely fundamental rather than the state in looking after veterans. And British veterans are very much, you know, after the service, in comparison to America, for example, is sort of pushed out into the wider welfare state and the wider charity sector. So it appears to me as if the 1930s is a real forerunner for the 2020s. And I suppose in the wider disability studies sort of angle, it's that disability and mental illness is a real flexible category, and can be created and adapted and manufactured in different political contexts. So Britain and Australia fought the same war on the same side, same battles. Yet the treatment of disability pensions in the 1930s are very, very different. And, you know, the legal and medical recognition of disability are, you know, yeah, completely different to one another. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.
Okay, an absolutely fascinating paper. Can I open the floor to questions?
I have lots of questions. I just didn't want to be greedy. I'm not going to ask all of them now. I was taking notes on my phone because I forgot a pen. Sorry. No, sorry. This is so interesting. We've talked about this. I just love how I love hearing about, because I'm attempting to go beyond the official records because there are so many veterans that you just cannot find. But you hear about them here and there, but how do we find them? And I'm just so interested in how other people are going beyond the institutions. I'm very fascinated in your study. And yes, it's probably about 3 books, if not more. Yeah. But my question is, so in Australia, the South African War veterans weren't getting the same pensions as First World War veterans until during the Second World War, when just before an election, they thought, oh, well, let's do this to make ourselves look good. We'll give South African War veterans. And at that time there were also changes to the way First World War veterans' pensions worked. And I wonder if this happened. I wonder if firstly that affected who you're looking at in Australia, but I wonder if that happened in Britain at around the same time, because politicians seemed to be very keen to show that they were pro-veteran or pro-soldier during the war. And I wonder if there's anything, I don't know, it's a side question, one of many.
No, it's a great question. Funny enough, there's a guy at Leeds working with Jessica Mayer, and he's looking at that exact subject. Sort of pre-1914 war disabled veterans. And there's a lot of files in the National Archives, were called, the name in the sort of policy arena was former war pensioners. So I know it was certainly discussed, because the records are there, but whether actually they were sort of upgraded and sort of treated as similar to disabled First World War veterans, or sort of still treated as veterans of the South African War, I'm not sure, but it is a study going on at the moment. Because it is, again, so I'm talking about the 1930s. Pre-1914 veterans is a real landscape of, in Britain. I know you've done it with your own research, but it's going to be a really important subject, I think.
But I wonder if it helped the First World War veterans,
the
situations as well of the First World War veterans, if that changed what they were, because dealing with, in Australia, the Department of Veterans Affairs, it was the Repack Commission then, was impossible. Even now it's impossible. And that's the reason why, as your archive showed, people didn't claim. I wonder if it changed things so it made it easier or more difficult for the veterans.
We have a question online from Libby.
Hi there. Hi, Michael. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, great. Look, that was such a fascinating talk, and I just want to say very quickly, first thing, that I think your idea about the story that bureaucracies tell themselves about the war in the interwar period is really fascinating. And I think the Americans have a story they're telling themselves, the British have a story, and I think it's a great framework for analysis. I was just thinking, since you're in Australia at the moment, I wonder if the papers of A.G. Butler, who is the official Australian medical historian of the First World War, might be worth looking at, because he certainly has a take on what the 1930s does to pension claims. He sort of accuses Australian soldiers of practicing, I think his phrase is neurotic embroidery on their pension claims. So soldiers would come in with physical problems and then also invoke psychiatric symptoms, and his interpretation was that was a function of the depression, so as a way to sort of get a slightly higher payment. But it took him 2 decades to write the medical history. He's really frustrated with the psychiatric aspect, and he's in contact with pension bureaucrats. So I think his papers are at the War Memorial, and it might be worth while you're here just having a read of those if you're not planning to already.
Oh no, thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely check those out.
Kathy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. Such an interesting project, and Effie and I have just started working on a project about mental health aftercare in the period from 1900 to 1960, which, there's so many echoes out there. Listening to your talk, just thought we're all moving in the same direction in that sense. I've got a question. You mentioned the role of families and women, and in the case records from the Preston archive, you've got women, wives talking about what they observe. I was listening to a really interesting radio broadcast many years ago now about a later period in Australia, post-Second World War, wives having to give psychiatric evidence about their husbands to obtain pensions after their husbands died. Okay. So I'm kind of curious about, and that was obviously very traumatic for those women and very difficult to do. They had to come up with kind of medical language to convince whoever was assessing the claim. So I'm interested if you're coming across more of that, or maybe you will, evidence from women who have to give testimony, in order to kind of themselves access pensions. I'm not sure if that's part of this.
Yeah, no, it's thanks, Kathy. One thing that's really interesting with regards to when these men are coming in with the family members, and the superintendent's making notes of, how long has he been like this, X, Y. The amount of times a family member will say, it's the war what done it, before the war, Very, very keen to say that, you know, it was, you know, and they'll say anything we should know about him, he served in the war. And it appears to me when and I've only just quickly looked through these records in the hope of doing proper analysis, so I'm over so when I return to the UK. But it really appears to me that this idea of it was the war, and that's something with my own great grandfather. It was, you know, told it was the war.
Yeah.
And I think certainly with regards there was a financial benefit to it, so even receipt of 100% pension if he was a service patient. But also, you know, as you know yourself, you know, the sort of detachment of stigma and things like that. But it comes up time and time again is testimony from family members saying he came home from the war, he's had periodic breakdowns, but now it's really bad. And there's always a direct linkage to the war in terms of he was fine, but recently lost his job. And that, in addition to the war, it's always sort of a cross-reference too.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful part of your project, actually, that articulation of what's invisible, because, you know, a lost limb is more visible. So other people giving voice to that is really fascinating. So I think that's great.
Thank you. Yeah, well, when I was going to the archives, so when I applied for the initial project, there was this idea of the prematurely aged ex-serviceman. And mental illness was just going to be one of, you know, 4 or 5 things I was looking at. And then I was really surprised when I got into the Lancashire archives and you're flicking through the case books and just how many were referenced of ex-soldiers. And that's when I realised actually this, which is better than, you know, going in and having nothing. But I was really struck by how often the soldiers come up in the case books in the 1930s. I mean, sometimes it's 2 or 3 in a row. It's as regular as that. So it's really do a quantitative analysis of how regular were these ex-soldiers.
Sorry, just on that point, I was just that quote about the delusion of the man with the stump. I find it really interesting that maybe when these men entered asylums that their physical conditions would have been sort of pathologized, made into this mental health condition and created this sort of visual of the mentally ill soldier that perhaps didn't fit in with what was going on. That's another interesting slide for another one of the books. But I'm very envious after looking at the South African War case books and finding, you know, one soldier every maybe 200 to have so many. It's going to be such rich research.
On that issue of the Lancaster War admission notes, I was really struck by the first one, where it appears that the scarring experience was not direct combat but burying the dead. And it got me thinking about, and pardon my ignorance, I'm familiar with Deborah Cohen's work from the German side of things, but really not from the British side. It got me thinking about, you know, the people who are engaged in non-combat roles like Labour Corps and other groups like that, for example. Are they cropping up in your work, or has work been done on their mental health?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, Ben, who served in the First World War but didn't see active service, really come up. And even in my old PhD, there was a man who used to, you know, put oil in aeroplanes, you know, miles behind the front line. He used to be admitted. But there's what's really interesting. I found one. So these men, when I'm talking about First World War veterans, you know, it can be, you know, men in sort of being clerks during the First World War, you know, filling out paperwork. And as well as obviously men who served on the Western Front and Gallipoli and things like that. I found one really interesting one where a case, and again, just one of these sort of personal stories where he goes into a lunatic asylum and he says he fought on the Western Front, saw really bad war service, and the superintendent writes to I believe it's his wife or his mother, and his mother goes back, oh no, he didn't. He served in Egypt looking after camels. So again, there's an idea of sort of, I think, especially with Journey's End and, you know, All Quiet on the Western Front, when we think of shell shock, we think of, you know, the trench, we think of mud, you know, industrial warfare. But actually, the men who I'm coming across served in Palestine, served, you know, in Gallipoli, not only on the front lines, but, you know, in administrative roles. So these men are coming up all the time. That's one thing I really want to try and do, actually, with regards to the quantitative analysis, is because if they have a former war service, they'll talk about what battalion they served and where they served. So once you get into the details, you'll be able to actually break down who served on active combat, who. Yeah, so I think it's something that's really It'll be interesting to look at further.
Okay, we've come to the end of the time, unfortunately, but please join me in thanking Michael again for an absolutely fantastic. Just before you go, a quick note that our next paper will be this Tuesday, the 9th of April, at the unusual time of 4 p.m, and that paper will be online only. Our speaker will be Christian Churchill from the Institute of Danube-Swabian History and Regional Studies in Tübingen, and he will present on Of Lives and Letters, the incomplete story of the incomplete correspondence between Sigmund Freud and Eduard Silberstein. We hope to see you then, and until then, try and stay dry.
Thank you.
Thank you.